Great. Thank you so much, Hillary. And it's great to be here. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy days to learn a little bit about drying garden produce and dehydrating. And it's a fun thing that I've been doing for many, many years. And I'm excited to share some information that's rather basic. So hopefully if you have no experience, or a little experience, you can find out, all that you would like to know to hopefully get started. So, and I'm coming from my home kitchen. I'm in Belfast, and I work for MOFGA as the Fair Food Liaison and Kitchen Manager, and I go by she, her pronouns. And I've been cooking and making food and working with food, growing food, loving to eat food like my entire life. And I keep a pretty large vegetable garden and medicinal and culinary herbs and fruit and berries and so forth. And so we'll talk about some of those things today. So one of the first things I wanted to start with is talk about why dry? There's a lot of different reasons, and people come at it for different reasons. Sometimes, you might have a surplus in your garden and you're wondering, what the heck should I do with that? And so being able to dry it, it's inexpensive, it's easy, it's an easy way to preserve the harvest. You don't have to have a lot of special equipment, even though I will be talking today about an electric food dehydrator that I've been using. I have another model that I'm not showing you today that my husband built for me that's kind of like a floor model. So it's really large, and it can accommodate like 6 big trays, like 2 feet by 2 feet each. But because I couldn't really bring that into my kitchen and show you, I'll be talking about the food dehydrator that is easily accessible and you can just purchase online pretty easily. It's also a really nutritious way to preserve the harvest. And again, if you're growing your own and you have a surplus, or maybe you just go to the farmer's market and you just get really taken by the beautiful beets that are there, and you're thinking, oh, I'd love to go home and make something with those beets. And so you buy 3 bunches, and then you realize, oh, maybe I should make something with these rather than just eating them fresh. But it's also nutritionally superior, especially if you dry at the lower temperature range, which would be anywhere from a minimum of 95 degrees up to about 125, maybe to 135. And again, that's going to be up to you. When you look at other food dehydration and dehydrating books, they may tell you to dry at 145 or something a little bit higher. And just know that that's fine too. You might sacrifice a little bit of the nutritional value that is kept in the dried material when you're doing it at the lower temperatures, but it's certainly not going to damage or harm the fruit or the vegetables if it's a little bit higher. There's also basically no chemicals or preservatives that are used when you food dehydrate. It's so basic that you're just removing, the moisture from the vegetable. And you'll see in the example of my zucchini chips, which are like the size of a dime, because right now at this time of year, the zucchini are just starting to come on. And so I didn't have the largest of zucchinis, but just know if you have large zucchinis, you too can make good-sized vegetable chips rather than my little like dime and quarter-sized ones. And because it takes all the moisture out of the vegetables, or pretty much most of it, it means it takes up far less room in your pantry or your kitchen or cupboards. And so that's, if you're tight on space, but you have enough room to keep your dehydrator somewhere when you want to use it, it means that the produce can be basically put up and kept in a cabinet year round and take up very little space. You don't have to keep your freezer running. You don't have to heat up your kitchen with, water bath canning or things like that. And also, the food will keep for several seasons, and it may lose some of its crunch, but or it's snap, and you can always just give it a little bit of warm up again in those same temperatures that you dehydrated at to bring it snap back. But it's great for if you're on the go and you want something healthy and you want to just bring something from home rather than like buying a snack when you're out and about. You can just bring like a little container or a little Ziploc bag with some nutritious dried fruit and vegetables with you. Or if you do eat meat, you can also use your dehydrator for jerky. We won't be talking about that today. That's a whole nother topic, but just know that there's a lot of information out there about doing meat jerky, fish jerky, and that sort of thing. So we'll be mostly talking about vegetables today. And then what I wanted to talk about next, and I wanted to show you, because I have a dehydrator right here next to me, and I'm going to be using, this is a Nesco Garden Master. It says right on the bottom there. And there are two types of electric food dehydrators. And the one that I'm using is a vertical flow. And so the vertical flow dehydrator has stacked trays. So once you take the lid off, you'll see that they have like slightly interlocking trays. And this one came with 8 trays. And so they just get stacked easily on top of one another. And the air and the fan in a vertical flow model is at the base of the unit. And so if I take off all of these, it just has a simple fan. When you plug it in, it just turns it on. And then with the vertical trays that are stacked, as you can see, it has a center where all the airflow comes up through. And so this model was one of the top rated models from, actually, I found a really good resource with the New York Times. They have an affiliate called Wirecutter that does like reviews of all sorts of kitchen equipment and that sort of thing. And they actually rated all different types, and this was one of their top models. Because one of the things about the vertical flow, because of how this one is designed in particular, but also vertical flow in general, you don't need to be rotating the trays like you do with a horizontal flow dehydrator. And that's the type that I don't have to show you, but it's out on my front porch. But it has trays that pull out towards you, and the fan is at the bottom, but yet it circulates in a way where it's kind of more like this. And even though it's, some of them actually have the fan in the back, mine has it at the bottom, and I have a little wooden lid to it that I just pull forward, and it just brings the air circulation right through. And I do have to rotate the trays every 3 to 4 hours, a quarter turn.
Hey,
I don't mind. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. If you want to just tilt up your screen a little bit more, then we'll
Okay.
be able to see your face. That's great.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the feedback there. And so the other thing about the horizontal flow trays that makes it a little bit more flexible is that if you want to take out a couple of trays and maybe do something like yogurt in there, you can do that. Whereas in a stacked tray in the type of model I just showed you, that's not really possible. And I think a lot of people, I don't know, maybe because I just love to cook and eat, and so I'm familiar with the Excalibur dehydrator. Some people may have heard that name before. That's an example of one of the models of a horizontal flow that has the square trays that pull out. And then there's also plenty of ways to dehydrate even more simply without an electric food dehydrator. So when you use any other kind of drying method, airflow is just about as important as heat to dry things properly. And so you can dry outside, but you would also want to cover it to keep off bugs and things like that, maybe with some muslin or some something thin so that it can still dry. There's also solar dehydrators that don't plug in at all and are just using the energy of the sun. And you've got this great, unit that will just, if the sun's out, you're good. You can also put a rack on top of your refrigerator, put things to dry in a warm, dry, dark attic, again, with something covering it, or maybe in a paper bag. An oven with a pilot light might work, but typical ovens don't usually go down low enough in temperature to be able to dry things properly. I happen to have a dehydrating feature on my oven, which I rarely use, but it's nice to have it for when I want to do something in the winter, when I have my big floor model packed away in the garage for the winter. So those are different kinds of ways that you can do it. I have a neighbor who likes to dehydrate above her refrigerator. She has a nice little area large enough to put in like a tray or a little shelf, something to set things on, a platter. And it's kind of dark, it's out of the way, it's warm from the airflow of the refrigerator. And so it's like a passive heat source that is great for if you just have a small amount of things.
Hey,
So
Wendy,
next, yes.
we did get one question in the chat. Somebody
Sure.
said that they're interested in using their outdoor pizza oven to dehydrate. Wondering if you know anything about that.
Well, I have never tried that before. We have a shared pizza / bread oven in where I live with some of my neighbors. And the one thing that I do know about drying or just even cooking in a pizza oven is that when you fire it up, I mean, the idea is to get it really hot. And typically you use that for things like pizza first, where you're just going to cook something very quickly and take it out. And when the pizza oven is up to temperature, I mean, you can do a pizza in about 2 to 3 minutes. It's very, very fast. And you've got the coals in there, and then that pizza oven is also acting as a really great like heat source. And so it holds the heat. And one of the things that you can do after you've used that pizza oven for like pizza, for example, it slowly cools down. And if you had a way or a thermometer that could take high heat, that would be readable for you, you could try to do it at the very tail end of when the pizza oven is cooling down, because you can kind of bake in your pizza oven after you've used like the high heat portion. It's kind of like, if you've got coals on a grill and you're grilling something, you want to put the things that require the most heat the longest time first. And then as the coals cool down, you can do other things that are a little bit more delicate. And most of these things that you would be drying, I would consider to be in more the delicate category. And so it would be probably some trial and error, is what I would suggest. And maybe there are some people out there that actually have done this and have written a book about it, or they have a blog or a website. And so I haven't used it personally. And so I'm just sharing just some of the tips that I know of that might be helpful. So I hope that answers that person's question. That's a good question though. So I'm going to talk a little bit about food dehydrating basics, and then we'll get into the process of doing some actual demonstrating of cutting and thicknesses and fruit leathers and some things that you can do with beets and zucchini is what I have today to play with. So, but you always want to start with fresh, good quality ingredients that are at their peak. You don't want anything that's rotten or overripe, because you're going to be storing this. I mean, if you're going to be eating it right away, that's one thing, but still, it's best when you're preserving food for the harvest, whatever it is, fermenting or canning or food dehydrating, try to use the best quality, that's right at its peak of ripeness. If there are any bruised or brown spots, like on fruit, for example, just cut it away before loading it into the dryer. And another thing that's really key about food dehydrating is doing uniform cuts. And so that's pretty key to getting consistent pieces that won't be drying at different rates. But again, it's really a no fault kind of system, because if you do have some that are thin and you do have some that are a little bit thicker, like if you're only cutting by hand, it's hard to get it uniform exactly every slice, as opposed to using a mandolin slicer, which I'll be using. That helps streamline it. It makes it go quicker, and it also gets a pretty even thin cut. And many of the mandolin slicers have like a thick or a thin or several different thicknesses that you can use. And I talked earlier about best drying temps, but general guideline is for herbs and leafy things around 95 degrees. Most vegetables can be in the 105 to 115 Fahrenheit, and things that are juicy, like tomatoes and juicy fruits, a little bit higher, 115 to 125, and melons can even be done from 125 to 135. And again, these are just a guide. It will take a little bit longer when you're doing something at the lower temperature, but that's what I like to do because I know it's maximizing the nutritional quality of the food. And so I don't have to have it done an hour sooner at a higher temperature. I just let it go a little bit longer at a lower temp. And again, just if you're starting out and you haven't done this before, I mean, just start simple. You could be doing something as basic as drying apples in the fall when there's lots of apples around. Maybe you've got a tree in your yard, or you're going to the farmer's market, or you have a CSA share and you've got apples galore. It's another way to preserve the harvest. And I love snacking on them throughout the winter. They're great, and you can rehydrate them and use them as sauce and things like that. And another thing is that once you're, I would recommend keeping a record. It's even like a little notebook, so you can kind of write down what you've done. What temperature setting did you put it at, or how did you dry it? How long did it take? Because that will really help inform you going forward with what else you want to be doing. And it'll be like, oh yeah, I know I really like to have that it worked well at 125, or maybe it took too long and you'd rather dry it at a higher temperature next time. But keeping notes with what worked and didn't will help you to improve your process. And if you made if something didn't come out the way you wanted it to, then hopefully you'll know why and can write that down and remember for next time, because sometimes you're only doing it once a year when the food is at its prime. And then once the food is done, you want to keep it sealed. And so dehydrated foods will stay fresh longer if you have them in an airtight container. So I've just been using, I don't think I have any right here in front of me, but I like a glass dish with a plastic lid, or a canning jar. I love putting things in canning jars because that's what I use. I try not to use plastic, or very little of it, but again, there's a time and a place for that as well. If you don't have room for glass, or you don't have a lot of glass, and if you want to travel with it, or backpack, or take it fishing, you might want to have it in a Ziploc bag to snack from. But those are the way, or dry storage containers work really well that have a tight fitting lid on it. So those would be things I would just recommend. And then lastly, I would say, before we get into the actual recipe demonstrations and so forth, is that, food dehydration has been around for millennia, right? Some say since like 12,000 BC. But you want to educate yourself about food safety and best practices, especially if you're going to be doing something other than produce and doing any kind of, meat protein, that type of thing, like jerky, for example, because you don't want to cause any foodborne illnesses. And there's a really great website that is easily accessible on the web, called the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And it's a really great resource for anything and everything about home food preservation and food safety. So I'm just going to throw that out there right now and just say that because you might want to refer to that website and get some tips and tricks, tips and so forth from them.
And Wendy, this might be a good time to mention that I will be sharing a resource from Wendy in the follow-up email, and that includes, I think, a link to that website, and also Wendy's recipes and some other tidbits. So
yeah, so I'm hoping that that will be a helpful addition to today's presentation, so that Hillary will be sending that out in the next day or so to everyone who signed up for the workshop. And it will have recipes for garlic zucchini chips, which I'll start with first and talk about, and then beet chips with an Asian-inspired marinade. And then I'm going to be demonstrating some strawberry rhubarb and talking about that fruit leather. And then also marinated dried tomatoes. I make dried tomatoes every year, and this is a great recipe that is so fun and easy to make with them. I always try to keep some in the fridge at all times. So now I wanted to just show you just the cutting of the garlic. And so I'm going to just move my screen and angle it down towards my cutting board. So you won't be seeing me so much, but you should be able to see my the food dehydrator and my mandolin. And I have some zucchini behind me. So this is a good size. This is larger than what I had to work with when I made some zucchini chips last weekend, because I wanted to be able to show you all kind of like the finished product, as well as demonstrate just kind of slicing and talking about just doing that on the mandolin. And again, don't worry if you don't have one. And because I'm only going to be doing a few slices, and I'm going to be holding the zucchini way up above the blade, I'm feeling pretty confident about this. But I would say if you're new to using a mandolin, be very careful. I mean, most of the time, like any mandolin will come with like a little safety holder, but that's kind of hard to use on a tall, skinny thing. But it's great to use when you start getting anywhere near your fingertips, because you really want to be careful, because this blade is like, it's killer sharp, and you don't want to start a big mess here in your kitchen. Anyway, so I have this set on a pretty thin slice, and I'm just going to do some quick slices here and then show you what I've got. So this is pretty ideal. And the reason you want to do it so thin is that if you want it crispy, then going for really thin, like 1/8 of an inch, is great. Because you can do it up to 1/4 of an inch, which would mean if I take this little blade out, I can just flip it around on this particular model, and then all of a sudden I've got like much thicker slices that are more like the 1/4 inch. Can you see that? And I found that these just take longer to dry, and then they were a little chewier. And so, but if you like that, then by all means do the thicker one or the thinner one based on what your preferences are. There really is no right or wrong. And if you end up with little pieces like this or like that, save it for your cooking, or maybe with your eggs for breakfast or something like that. If it's, a mostly intact piece like this, I'd say go ahead and use it. And then the recipe that you'll be getting that accompanies the dried zucchini, or to be dried into zucchini chips, is basically a pretty simple recipe. And this is what what mine look like when they're done. And see how teeny tiny they are? They're like little bite-sized ones, and even some of the circles. I mean, I started off with zucchini that were They were smaller than they were more like 1 inch, and they were the biggest I could find because I have zucchini growing in my garden, but it's not producing yet. So, but anyways, this is an example of, just the little size that I got. And as I said, the larger your zucchini in circumference, then, you can get larger pieces, but boy, it just shrinks down like nothing.
Hey,
And so
Wendy, I have
yes,
maybe two questions that are
sure.
sort of related to what you're talking about.
Yes.
One person asked, do you recommend sort of the same diameter, like an eighth of an inch or so for most sliceable vegetables, or are there certain things that you would recommend not doing so thin?
Well, I could, I'll try to address that by using the foods that we're doing today as an
Mm,
example. So, um, I, when it comes to like things that you want to make into chips, for example, the 1/8 inch works great. So zucchini, you could eat, I mean, I suppose you could do turnips. I haven't done those, but carrots, that type of thing, I would keep to the thinner type. But when it comes to tomatoes, I mean, they're so fleshy that you could easily get by with doing the thicker 1/4 inch for sure. And so I would kind of use that as the rule of thumb. I mean, I've used the 8 inch, 1/8 inch slice for like the things like beets or zucchini, for example. And I would do something like even mushrooms. You may not be growing them yourself, but if you're doing mushrooms, for example, you could be doing those a little bit thicker because they have a lot of water content and you don't want them to shrivel up. Now, I've done strawberries before, and I just dried whole ones, but I did slice them. And they came out like little tiny thin chips. And so that wasn't my favorite, but there's also this balance. If it's too thick, then if it doesn't dry quickly enough and you don't have a good airflow and a good setup, it can either darken or it could mold before it finishes dehydrating.
mm,
And some fruits you can dip in either like lemon juice or citric acid. I think even pineapple juice might help with the coloring and having it stay, more colorful and turning. Because like the reason people use, sulfur, or on like things like apricots, it's just so that they'll stay bright. But I don't really care to eat things with that have that in it, and so I'd rather have like a dark apricot and know that it's all organic and it doesn't have additives in it. The
mm,
other thing that I would talk about is that one of my favorite things, because I've dried a lot of tomatoes over the years, and I used to dry just slicing tomatoes and have to slice them, and oftentimes they just I didn't really love how they turned out. They were either too thin, and sometimes some parts would darken. And boy, once I found the trick to dehydrating cherry tomatoes, I'm all about that now. That's all I do when it comes to tomatoes. And so I've got a whole quart jar of these, and I can't tell you how many pounds of cherry tomatoes that this actually represents, but it's quite a few. And I'll do trays and trays of these, and I'll have like maybe 3, 4, up to 6 quart jars, because when I make the dried marinated tomatoes that will be in the recipe that you're getting, I'll use, almost 3/4 of a jar for just one recipe, and that makes about a quart. And so I have some that's already made right here, which doesn't really look like a whole lot but it's marinated with all sorts of dried herbs and thinly sliced fresh garlic and olive oil. And I basically, all I do when I dry cherry tomatoes, this little thing, this little dried tomato is just 1/2. So it's so easy. I just cut the cherry tomatoes in half. I put it cut side down on the tray and I dry them. That's it. And one of the things that kind of would frustrate me sometimes when I was doing just slices of tomatoes if they were so thin that by the time they dried, I'd have to like almost peel them off of the tray, because they were so thin, they just kind of stuck to it. And I don't have any sticking problems with these. They just kind of, they shrivel up and they release. And so, and they're the perfect bite-sized piece for an appetizer. You can even put this in pesto and make pesto out of this, like a sun-dried tomato pesto. I just use it as a condiment with lunch or as an appetizer with goat cheese or something like that. So it's really versatile. But that's what I would say about the doing tomatoes. And so again, you know, there are books and guides that do have suggestions for different types of vegetables that I'm not discussing today. And so if I didn't answer that person's question exactly, and you have something that in mind that you grow and you really want to dry, then you can probably find that information either on that Center for Dehydration website, or I have a couple of books also that are some resources that I found helpful that will be resources that will be shared with people after the webinar today.
Yeah, Wendy, I didn't want to stop you because you were saying such valuable information, but the person actually clarified that I misinterpreted their question.
Oh, shoot. Okay.
They were actually wondering about the diameter of the vegetables that you put into the dehydrator. I don't want to hold you up too much,
Okay.
but if you can answer that one quickly,
sure.
I'm sure they'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Sure. So what I would say is it's going to be based on what your dehydrator will be able to accommodate. So this particular model, since it has, you know, that air vent in the center, you know, even when, because I do want to make sure we get to the fruit leather too, but this has a little, so this is, I don't know, looks like, you know, maybe 18 inches across. I haven't measured it, but this is what you use, this opaque one that's kind of solid, as opposed to a perforated one that this comes with, that's for putting vegetables on, for example, or individual pieces. You're going to just need to work with your food dehydrator. And if you have
as long as it fits on your dehydrator, it's not too big.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it just depends, like, what are you drying that is so big that you want to leave it whole? Do you have room to put it away when it's dry, when it's a really big piece? Like, you know, with fruit leather, you just cut it up. And, you know, that's kind of what I did over here. You know, I took the, you know, the whole leather that came off of here, and then I just cut it into 4 sections, and then I rolled it up with some parchment paper. And then that's how I store it. And then that way, when I'm on the go, I can just like whip one of these out and like take it with me, and it's good to go. But yeah,
Awesome. That's great.
think there's no limit.
And I'm going to ask one last question, because I didn't originally intend to. Someone wondering what type of mandolin that is, if you know the brand name.
Yeah, this is a German one called Borner. And it's relatively inexpensive. It is all plastic, and it's a little bit more lightweight than there's another mandolin that actually I'm eyeing that I think I like better than this one, which is called a Benringer. And that one is Benringer. And it's made from a more dense plastic that isn't really flexible like this one, and it doesn't need to be flexible. But this one has several julienne blades, and I've never used them. I don't julienne much with this. I mostly use it for slicing. But this is it's a good enough mandolin, and I've been making use of it for quite some time. But the Benringer is also another good brand. That I just like how it feels. It just feels a little bit more sturdy, and has little blades that actually go in and out, that you can just like, but different. It's just, Same but different.
That's great.
So
I'll try
that's
to include links to both of those so people can
okay,
check
great.
them
I
out.
didn't think to include that, but that would be helpful for
Right.
people who are interested in getting one. Um, and so once you have like sliced all your zucchinis, um, basically to make the garlic zucchini chips, you would just put a little bit of olive oil, like maybe a tablespoon to about 3 largish zucchini slices, and maybe a teaspoon of fresh garlic, and perhaps a half a teaspoon of salt. It's basically to taste. And then you would just mix it by hand with your hands. And then I was going to show you what it would look like when you're putting it on the tray. Oh, you can't see that. Sorry. Let me just angle my. So now you can see that a little bit better. So when you're, there we go. So I hope you don't make you dizzy. So you basically just, you space them closely together, but you don't want to overlap. And as they dry, of course, they're going to really shrink up, but they can be touching a little bit, but you want to make sure that there's air space all around them, because that will just provide more even airflow and even air drying. And, you know, I did my zucchini chips on the day of the rainstorm. For those of you who are living in Maine, we had the remnants of a hurricane, and we got 5 inches of rain that day, and it was really humid. And so I let the zucchini chips go longer just because it was so humid in the ambient air. And so again, you know, it's kind of like, you know, proofing bread or things like that. It's going to depend on how much humidity is in the air, or even making the bread too, because, you know, if there's a lot of humidity, it may take more or less flour depending upon what the ambient air and the ambient temperatures are. And so I just wanted to show you also the beets. I have some beautiful beets over here. And this is one of the, again, I don't have any beets from my own garden to show yet. But this is one of those beautiful chogias that, you know, have those great circles and beautiful pattern. But I got these at the local farmers market from one of Mofca's certified organic growers, and they had a selection. And these are, okay, no wonder this is on the thick setting. So that's too thick. You know, especially for a beet, I have to switch this around and go back to the thin blade setting. And again, don't try this at home without some protection. They also have something called no-cut gloves. And so if you're concerned about the safety of your fingers, which you should be if you're using one of these, especially if you don't use the little safety guard, I left the top on so I could just hold it long enough just to show you. But they do sell no-cut gloves, and you'll probably find them listed along with the mandolins. So I'm not getting the greatest slices. Some of them are coming out like partials, but I have a few good ones. But again, this is like pretty thin, 1/8 of an inch, I would estimate. And again, that's that big thick one that was the first side. And so same principle would apply. You'd have your marinade, and then these beets actually soak in the marinade for about an hour, and then you drain them off, and then put them onto your tray. And again, you know, just the same principle of leaving some airspace around them.
Wendy, if you could just, bring that a little bit more in
Yeah,
front of
sorry,
you.
I wasn't looking.
Oh, no worries. We are catching the corner of it. That's fine.
Okay. So
Great.
again, you know, just like kind of close to one another, but not overlap. You know, you don't want them overlapping like that. You really want them just with a little bit of space in between them for airflow. And the nice thing that I discovered, because I hadn't made this particular recipe before for the beets, but the marinade was so delicious that I've used it for other things, salad dressing, um, you know, other beet salads you could just do with the leftover marinade from the from doing the dried beet chips. You can also use it not only for salad dressing, but also for like a fresh beet salad. It was delicious. I took the marinade and I marinated some steamed beets that I took to a potluck like the next day. So it does double duty. And I even saved what was left over from the garlic zucchini chips too. It's not as great because the zucchini has so much water, as you can imagine, that it basically tends to water down the marinade. And so the garlic zucchini chips don't need to marinate. The beets do, because they're just so much thicker and sturdy. And so it takes them a while, but even after an hour, they started to soften up. And boy, are they infused with a whole lot of flavor. It's really great. So, and I'll show you, these are my finished example of beet chips. So, and with this humidity that we have today, these were dry to almost a snappy, you know, so I could just like snap them. This one a little bit, but anyways, they're definitely kind of rehydrated a little because it's such a moist day today with fog outside, and I've got the window open. And but anyways, this is what they look like, but great little snack chips to either, you know, dip in some hummus or just to eat straight out of hand. And the recipe for this one, it has rice vinegar and some soy sauce or tamari, some cilantro. I also put in a little bit of fresh garlic and a little bit of toasted sesame oil, and just delicious. So I'm kind of aware of the time, and I wanted to show you and talk about fruit leather next. So I already have some fruit leather puree made and ready to go. And so I have it in this jar right here. This is a pint-sized canning jar, and I think it will be just enough to do on one tray. And so I wanted to show you and talk about making fruit leathers next. So away goes the mandolin. And then I wanted to just talk about fruit leathers. So, and I'll angle the camera back again at that when I'm ready to do that. But I made a strawberry rhubarb fruit leather puree, and you can keep it chunky. I cooked it, and I basically did about half and half of fresh strawberries and fresh sliced rhubarb. I threw it in a pot. I you know, bring it up to temperature until it starts to bubble and boil, and then I simmer it, you know, for, I don't know, 20 minutes or a half an hour. And because I love ginger, I threw some fresh grated ginger in there. But again, that's something that you know, do it to your palate. You know, if you want to just do straight strawberry, go for it. I would probably recommend maybe cutting rhubarb with something else, unless you're just a diehard rhubarb fan, because it does take a fair amount of sweetener. And the recipe is pretty flexible in terms of flavorings or sweeteners. I mean, feel free to use maple syrup from Maine, you know, so you can get certified organic syrup and put that in instead of white cane sugar that comes from, most of that comes from out of this country. And if you're going to get it, just make sure it's like free trade and non-GMO and hopefully organic as well. But you're basically just going to season it with, or sweeten it to taste. I also put a little bit of vanilla extract in there to just give it a little bit of undertone. You can't really taste it. And then once it was cooked, I let it cool down. and then I pureed it. And you can puree it in a food processor of any kind, a blender. And that's just because I didn't want it lumpy when it was dried. And again, it doesn't really matter. By the time it's cooked, it's pretty well stewed. And, you know, there might be some lumps or bumps in there mostly of rhubarb because the strawberries kind of cook down before the rhubarb pieces do. But when you have it in a puree, then it's a nice, smooth, even consistency, and your fruit leather just comes out nice and smooth. And so that's what I did. So I'm going to show you with the finished strawberry rhubarb how that works. And basically, you can see me from there. I'm going to just pour it. Just kind of gradually around the center of the tray. And you can see I've got a spatula here, not only for scooping every bit of goodness out of the jar and not wasting anything in there, but also then I use the spatula to smooth it out. Now, unlike slicing vegetables, when you do fruit leather, you want it to be a little bit thicker on the edge. And that might seem a little counterintuitive, but it's just because the edges dry quickly and you want to be, it's just how it dries basically. And so you're just going to use like a spatula. I found like this size spatula worked really well for spreading. I had an offset spatula that can be used for baking. And I'm like, that was too long. The thing was like, you know, it's like that narrow and about, you know, 6-8 inches long. And it's like, well, that wasn't going to fit with my tray. But I found that it almost feels like you're frosting a cake. And when you're just kind of, I found too that it was like, oh, I could kind of spin this around a little bit and smooth it out. But when you're smoothing it, you just want to make sure that it goes to the edges, but not over. And that it's, again, a little bit thicker on the edge. And if you see any spots where it starts to almost show through, that means it's a little too thin. And it's not the end of the world. It just means that by the time it finishes drying, you'll have some thinner spots. I have a little bit more to kind of fill in those gaps there. But it just means that your finished product might have like some see-through areas. So it's not a problem. And I was very heartened by using this particular dehydrator in fruit leather. It was way faster. And I also did it on a drier day. So I don't know how much of it was the drier day, or was it just because it was the fruit leather, but it really dried like overnight. Whereas the chips, the beets and the zucchini, you know, took me like over a day, over, you know, 24 hours or so. And again, you know, that's why I suggest keeping a notebook of your trials and then afterwards what worked and what didn't. So you can see I've got it almost spread out to the very outer edge and the very inner edge. So now I'm just gonna kind of level it out. And when I was doing it, it's like, I can't really tell if this looks right or not, but it kind of does. And boy, when I took it out, it was perfect. So that's, and then you would basically just put the lid back on. And I don't have an outlet here to plug it in, but it would make a little bit of a noise. So it'd be kind of annoying to have it on. But basically, you would use this particular tray. And if you're using another food dehydrator that doesn't come with some kind of fruit leather tray, you can use just cooking parchment and kind of tape down the edges. on a screen or a tray that you're using, you know, whether it's like a nylon mesh or something, or food grade nylon mesh, you wouldn't want to do it right on the screen. And so on the tray below this, you know, this is the screen that you put like other things on, whether it's cut up fruit or cut up vegetable slices. You can also, in this one, you can put it directly right on the tray itself. But I just found, well, it comes with as many of these, and with this particular model, with that tray insert on top of it. And it just makes it easy to get it out of there. You just pick it up. They have two little indentations on either side, so you can kind of get your finger there and pick it up. And I would also just recommend that if you're doing some dehydrating, is try to do all of the same thing at the same time, especially when you're getting started, because different, like if you're doing beet chips and fruit leather and maybe some mushrooms, you know, they're all going to be drying at different times. And then you have the you know, just the factor that I didn't really want garlic zucchini chips being dehydrated in the dehydrator, well, along with my strawberry rhubarb fruit leather, because I just thought, well, you know, the smell, the taste, maybe, you know, and I have quite an acute sense of taste and smell, and so I would detect it. My husband wouldn't. But and so I wanted to show you a completed piece of fruit leather. So this, and I thought at first, oh my gosh, when it was done, I was like, am I going to be able to get this off? Because some people do recommend maybe a little light bit of oil, very little, just so it releases easily. But what I found was that when I took it out of the dehydrator and just let it sit for like 10 minutes, it got enough moisture back in it just from those few minutes to just be able to lift up a corner with a dull, you know, just like a butter knife kind of thing. Nothing that was going to, you know, scratch the plastic or the dehydrator. And then once I was able to get a little purchase on one little edge, then the whole thing just peeled right off, and it was beautiful. And then again, as I said, I cut it into quarters. It looks like about a good serving to me, but you can see kind of the light areas on that piece. That's where it's a little bit thinner. And so again, not a big deal. And then you just peel it off, and you could roll it up and just take a bite. But I've been saving it for today, so I've just been tasting the actual the puree, because I had a little bit of leftover, and it's like delicious with yogurt and other things like that. So, but that's basically what I was going to cover today, and I would look forward to some questions, and yeah, and can't wait for you to get to the recipes and maybe try this at home.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I have been collecting questions, and we have
Great.
lots. I'll just say, you all should have the power to unmute yourself. So if I ask your question and I've misinterpreted it, or you want to add anything, that's a great time to just unmute yourself and go for it. So let's see, starting at the top of this list, someone was wondering about the length of time required for dehydrating different things, specifically for different kinds of herbs. Does each one have a different amount of time it usually takes?
Well, I dry a lot of herbs. I even have some back here to give you an example of some of the things that I dry. I dry like gallons of nettles because I love them as tea throughout the winter, and especially when, you know, greens are maybe in short supply locally. I just love the taste of dried nettle tea. And so I put up a lot of those in May in my dehydrator. And honestly, I don't keep track of how much time it takes. So I just, because I'm also doing my large floor model vertical fan dehydrator is out on the front porch. It's a little bit, so it's exposed to the moisture. I mean, it's a covered porch and it doesn't rain in on it, but and then I have to alternate the trays. So I would say, again, it's more important that you know what you're looking for when it comes to the end product versus like how much time is it going to take. And there are rules of thumb out there that you'll find, like in that National Center for Food Dehydrating. They do give some estimates of time, but if you know what to look for, then when it reaches that stage, however long it takes, then you know, oh, it's done. And that's even more important than knowing, oh, it's supposed to take 8 hours. So if it's 8 hours, that means I take it out. Well, 8 hours with humidity might be very different than 8 hours in hot, dry sun.
So what do you look for, Wendy? What are your
So
key
with
indicators?
herbs, yeah. So with herbs, in general, you want it, and even dried things in general, you want to dry it until it snaps. Now, something like dill, which I have in here, that doesn't snap. It's very fine, but it's very dry and fluffy. And so you want it to, if it still bends, like if even the leaves that the stem are on, if the stem still bends, it's probably needs to be dried a little bit more. I often dry with the stems and then I take it off the stems to actually put it into jars. And there's nothing wrong with having some stems, but it takes up a lot more space. And so, or if I'm just doing tips of things, like I love growing and drying and using sacred basil throughout the winter. And I use that in tea. I use it in my homemade kombucha. And that, again, should be crispy, dry, pretty much. And so when I was saying in the recipes, for example, for the vegetables, I said it can take up to 24 hours, depending upon, the ambient heat, the ambient humidity. You just need to check it. And there are some rules of thumb out there that you can find on the internet and in some of the books on drying.
Yeah. Someone asked, is freeze drying the same as dehydrating? Is freeze drying something you ever do?
I have never freeze dried. And it is a different process because, but I can't really speak to it because I haven't really played with that. And maybe there is somebody who wants to chime in that may have tried that before.
Yeah. If anyone has, chime in. Next question that came in was about vacuum packing. Is that something that would extend the storage life of something you've dehydrated? Would you ever recommend that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an option. And again, I'm a pretty low tech person, even though I love to cook and I've, been doing this type of stuff all my life. But it's another piece of equipment. It's to do the vacuum packing, you have to have a vacuum sealer and you got to have the device and the unit and then the bags that it works with. But it certainly would, I think it would definitely extend the life of things because it draws out all of the air and makes it much more of a tight seal. And so in that respect, it'd probably keep it fresher longer. How much more? Hard to say. It would also be a little less bulky if you had less room, but you had room for the vacuum packer. But again, I don't have one, and I usually, again, just store things in jars up in my dry, dark attic for the winter. Yeah.
Great. Somebody else was asking about storage. I think you had mentioned perhaps it was keeping your marinated tomatoes in the fridge. This person asked, are there any dried foods that you need to keep in the fridge? Do you want to just clarify?
Sure. The fridge is is a place where it's good for keeping things that are more perishable. If it's just dried all by itself and it's a fruit leather or a vegetable or piece of fruit, you don't need to refrigerate it. The reason I do refrigerate my marinated tomatoes is that it does have fresh garlic in it and it has oil in it. And you do need to be careful with kind of food safety for making infused oils that have like garlic in it and that type of thing, because foodborne bacteria can multiply in there. And so I leave it out, and the recipe goes through this. You thin slice the garlic and you add the dried herbs, and then you rehydrate the actual dried tomatoes in apple cider vinegar. And that gives it a whole big punch of flavor. And then you strain that off, and you save that too for salad dressings and other kinds of things that you want to make, maybe a pasta sauce or something where you want a little bit of punchy vinegar tomato flavor. But and then I mix in the oil and the garlic and the herbs, and I marinate it for just a day, for like 24 hours out on the counter with a cover on it. And after that, I keep it in the fridge. But by all means, it's good to actually take it out to let it, the olive oil kind of come back to somewhere around room temperature. You can certainly eat it. If it's just for yourself, you can just eat it right out of the jar, and the olive oil does congeal a little bit. But if you can take it out for just an hour or half an hour, it just takes some of the chill off, and the flavor is even a little bit more pronounced than if it was straight out of the fridge. But in general, you don't really need to do that for most things that aren't in oil.
I can't wait to try making those. We had another question that you sort of ended up touching on. One person asking about dehydrating stinky things like garlic, and what else did he mention? So like, yeah, does it sort of stick with the dehydrator? Would you recommend like having a separate dehydrator ever for that thing?
Well, that's a really good question. I find just in general, the plastic just tends to absorb odors, and because of my sensitive smell and taste buds, like I took a jar out tonight to put the fruit leather in, and I had one in my cabinet this afternoon, and I took the lid off, and I'm like, whoa, what was that smell? And I'm like, I smelled the glass jar, and I could detect that it was probably like the sun-dried marinated tomatoes I had in there with the garlic. And because I use plastic lids that can go on canning jars when I'm just using them for storage. And I find that the plastic does absorb that. So I've been known to keep separate trays that are marked for garlic only. And so maybe what you want to do is just put a little piece of tape on the outside of that tray or two, and just like, garlic smelly things or whatever you want to call it, and just use it like that. And I know, for example, I'm just going to say about this particular model of this Nesco Garden Master dehydrator, you have to use a minimum of 4 trays to have it running. And it could be you're only drying 1 tray worth of like fruit leather, but you need to have the other 3 trays in there because it needs a certain volume to be able to circulate the air correctly. And so that being said, I would just recommend doing those smelly things all together. And maybe you could also try soaking the trays afterwards, maybe a little baking soda, some warm soapy water for sure. That's how they recommend cleaning it anyways. And, because this one does come with these insert trays, you can either choose to use them or not use them with the smelly things. So it's just one less thing that gets smelly. So
Those
I
are
don't
some
know.
great tips.
Yeah, just
Something
some
to mention.
ideas.
Yeah. And that sort of something you were just saying about the trays needing to have at least 4 in the dehydrator, but it doesn't matter if they're full. Is that right? You can
Right.
just, doesn't matter how much stuff is in there. It's always going to dry. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And even if it's just like one tray and then there's 3 empty ones, that one tray will still dry just fine. And as things dry, feel free to consolidate too. I do that, but I just, again, like with something like this that dries very evenly with this particular model of dehydrator, you can consolidate as long as you didn't have some thin slices and some thick slices all together on the same rack. I would recommend just, if you're doing all the same thing, you can consolidate it if it's more or less the same thickness. I did have, when I was experimenting with my mandolin about, the thickness and which one I like better for the beet and the zucchini, I ended up with some thin ones and then a few thick ones, and I kept the thick ones together. And in the long run, I still took them all out when they were all dry, and I put them all in the same jar. So here you go.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Wendy, amazingly, we're down to our last 5 minutes.
All
We've
right.
got, we've got we've still got some questions.
Okay. I'll try to be more brief.
I'm gonna start with one about mushrooms. Any tips for drying chanterelles or mushrooms? I know you already mentioned you can slice them a bit thicker, and specifically one person mentioned powdering chanterelles. Is that
yes. Because that was one of the things that I didn't touch on, because I didn't have any to make to show you, but I did want to talk and touch on pantry powders. And you can do them from dried herbs to vegetables or mushrooms. I mean, mushrooms are full of like umami flavor. It's like that 6th flavor, right? And it's just like, if you dried mushrooms, again, until they're pretty stiff, then you can actually powder them. So the same thing would be for black trumpet mushrooms, which are very thin mushrooms. They're almost flabby. They're so thin. And chanterelles, they'll shrink down, but if you're going to powder them or powder anything, whether it's some citrus rind or garlic or onion, you have to make sure it's completely and utterly dry. And then you would put it in like a spice grinder or something like that, that maybe you just use for spices. Do not mix it with your coffee grinder, either, unless you want coffee flavored mushrooms, or the other way around. But I have a separate spice blender grinder that I just use for things like that. But again, very, very dry if you choose to powder them and then use that for flavoring. But wow, it adds a whole big level of flavor and intensity, and you can do that with beets or carrots and that type of thing as well.
Great. Wendy, we've had a couple people ask about jerky. Do you want to talk for a couple minutes before we finish up about jerky? Do you have experience?
Sure.
To share?
Actually, one of the things that I think that is great about making your own jerky is that you can flavor it however you want. And then it's something that you can just have for like instant protein on the go, hiking, fishing, camping, or just running around town with errands, and then you've got like something to tide you over. So there's a lot on the internet about drying jerky, and so I won't go into it much here, but usually you can do like a very simple marinade. There are certain types of cuts that are ideal. Most people look for, when you're doing jerky, for a less fatty cut of meat. And that said, I have a farmer at the farmer's market who I get some of my grass-fed organic beef from, and he does it with fatty meats. So, but it's just, it can spoil more easily if you have really fatty cuts of meat versus more lean cuts of meat. And depending upon, whether you like it tough or or I should say chewy, or if you want it a little bit more tender, you cut it in either, against the grain or with the grain of the beef. And so I could do a whole demo on like jerky, but that's all I'm going to say about it today, just because of our time.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of fun to make, and you can make it hot and spicy, or kind of Asian inspired. Again, like
Mm.
lots of different flavor mixes, and
Awesome. Maybe a future webinar topic.
maybe, yeah.
Wendy, because we're at 6:14, I think I'm going to put one more question to you, and then
Sure.
I was thinking maybe because we do have a few more questions that haven't been answered, maybe you could provide some short answers in written format in the follow-up email, if that's something you think you'd have time for.
I might.
You
This
might,
week
yeah.
is a little bit tight in terms of
Yeah.
my time, but if I have time tomorrow, that would be the chance I could do it, because I was actually going to head out of town early Friday
Oh
morning.
yeah. Okay. Well, that might be something we can make happen. I'm going to ask you one more question that's next
Sure.
on the list for now. Um, let's see. Yeah, someone was asking about ideas if you're dealing with bigger volumes of produce. That person, feel free to chime in if that was your question. I guess if you had any general tips for recipes that make sense if you're dealing with like a lot of something.
Yeah. Well, when I have a lot of something, that's why I love my large dehydrator. Um, and and if and when I do tomatoes, I mean, we're doing it over the course of weeks, and as they ripen, and sometimes the dehydrator is full of nothing but like 6 trays of tomatoes. And the thing about it is just like, know what you like. And so if maybe you just have a bumper crop, but hopefully if you're growing some things of your own, you're growing things that you really love. And so if you can dry it, then maybe you can make something out of it. I don't I find that I'm growing less of the things that I just don't love, that I either just want to grow it myself because I love it fresh. Or I want to dehydrate it and then save it for the winter, whether it's tea, herbs or medicinal herbs, or I'm cooking with. And so tomatoes, my cherry tomatoes are like one of my main staples. And if you have like a surplus of carrots, I know you can store them for the winter, but you could also play around with making carrot powder and using that in soups or stews, or even in a carrot cake recipe, So there are some pretty creative things that you can do when you have a surplus, but that's about all I can probably say right now in
Yeah.
the time we have.
Yeah, that's great. Well, lots of thanks coming into the chat.
Oh,
And
great. Well, I'm so glad. I'm really,
Can I interrupt for a second? This is Adrian. I'm in New Hampshire.
oh, hi, Adrian.
Hi. So I'm loving this. This is so wonderful. But I'm intrigued by whatever this outdoor dehydrator is that you were referring to, because in the context of having a multitude of produce, it would be interesting to know. I mean, I've seen people that have their own devised, made frames, wooden frames that have some sort of a screening and, like a homemade kind of dehydrating system. And so in the context of having a lot of produce and trying to figure out how to consistently dehydrate something, I was more curious about whatever this outdoor system is that you have, and how much you utilize it, and whether you find it necessary to utilize that over your indoor electric dehydrator. So that was kind of the thinking behind my question.
Sure. I'll just speak to it really quickly in that I'm sad to say that the book and the model is that this comes from, that I have now, is no longer being made. So the book is no longer in print. It's called Dry It, You Like It. And I can't recall, I would have to run away from the computer to go grab the book, because it's so fun. It's just like a paperback, all handwritten, and like self-published practically. It's like, it's a really, from the 70s or something. It's gonna date me. Anyways, they had a model that you could buy it as a kit and put it together, and they sent you like almost all of the material except for the wood. But it's no longer being made. And so, but the design for it might be out there. I mean, there are designs on the web, for making your own dehydrator. And actually, I have to say that Hillary used one of my photos of to advertise this this workshop, which is actually the inside of, or kind of like looking down on, my food dehydrator that I have outside with the trays pulled out. And so that's a little bit of a glimpse. But anyways, so I wish
So neat,
that was,
Wendy. I wish they were still publishing that book.
I know,
Bummer.
right? Yeah.
I mean, if I can find anything on the internet in terms of copies of the plans, I'll share that with folks.
Yeah, and I can try to send you something too, Hillary, that you could share, if there were. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be the kind of thing that if you found it, it'd be out of print and it would probably cost a lot of money to get a copy.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Oh.
Well,
I'm sorry. What would be really helpful when you do, the email at the end, if you could just take some photographs, the front, side, and top or something, just to give an idea of the design and the way it's put together, that would be helpful. And also what type of heating source you're using.
Yeah, we got the heating element, I think, from them. I don't think we had to put that together, but yeah, it's a pretty basic but very utilitarian model, and I wish they were still putting it together as a kit. But I'll see what I can do in the time that I have, since I know Hillary would like to get this out sooner than later. So, but thanks for that suggestion.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here, everyone. And thank Wendy for sharing all of your experiments and knowledge gleaned over many years of dehydrating. This has been great.
Well, really, really happy to do it. And thank you all for attending and asking such great questions. All right.
Have a nice night, everyone.
Thank you.